Hello, PCSians. This will be the second part of my discussion regarding chapter 4, and then I also added the last part, which is chapter 5, which is writing conclusions and recommendations. So again, in a qualitative research, data collection and data analysis should go together. They should be done simultaneously, meaning as a researcher, you should be able to go back and forth between the data that you got and the analysis process. So how do we do that? Number one is we review our research questions. Okay. Once we are done collecting data from the interview, for example, you're going to analyze it already. You have to revisit the research questions that you formulated because the research questions, again, these are the questions that serve as guide for you as a researcher as to how you will go about your research and as to what you're going to find out, what you want to find out in your research. Okay, so in that way, we are able to filter the answers of our respondents, which answers or which part of their answers are connected to our research questions. In that way, we are able to narrow down the data that we collect. Also, we can go back to the purpose of your research. If your research is qualitative and if your research is more on describing the experiences or exploring the experiences of the topic or the phenomenon, so it also helps you narrow down the data that you got. Also, another way of reporting your findings is to relate your findings with the RRL. So I've mentioned this before when we are analyzing the data that we got from our interview, assuming that we collected data from our respondents, we try to find similarities or similar findings from the literature or from the sources of literature that we use in chapter 2, which may also help us interpret, okay, the data that we collected. Now, the concept of divergence and convergence will also help us in analyzing and reporting or presenting the data. So when we say convergence, it's about looking for similar data, okay, and clustering them together or grouping them together. For example, if I have 5 respondents and 3 of them have similar or common answers, therefore I may use convergence in presenting them, in presenting their answers in my chapter 4. Whereas divergence is more on the differences among the data. Okay? So kung meron akong 5 respondents, tas lahat sila magkakaiba ng sagot talaga, I can use divergence in order to present the data from the data that I collected. So, so much for chapter 4. Just please study the previous lecture that we have regarding that, and then um, please study the instructions regarding the um, equivalent work that I provided regarding chapter 4. So this time, chapter 5 is more on writing the conclusions and recommendations. Conclusions are essentially judgment statements that are logically arranged or that are logically reached at the end of the research paper. Okay, so When we say logically rich through the investigation of the research topic, meaning conclusions should be evidence-based. Kung ano yung kinalabasan ng interview nyo sa respondents nyo, kung ano yung kinalabasan ng data na nakolekta nyo sa mga respondents, dapat doon din tayo mag-base ng conclusion natin. So that is what we call conclusions that are logically reached through the investigation of the research topic. Consider conclusions as your final word, meaning these are the key takeaways or realizations or insights that you really want to impart to your readers. Again, conclusions should also be based on the research questions. Of course, this time, in this part, you should be answering the research questions that you formulated before. Dito nyo yun sasagutin. Aside from that, we can also have an incidental conclusion. Pag sinabi natin incidental conclusion, these are realizations or insights that came out during your research process. Hindi nyo siya ina-expect na nangyari, pero nangyari siya during your research process. So you can add that as an incidental conclusion. Hindi siya part ng research nyo talaga, hindi siya part ng research questions, pero dahil um, nag-occur siya during your interview or during your analysis part, you can do that by way of having an incidental conclusion. So let's have an example of um, conclusion, how we write conclusion. So yung naka-number dyan, yung 1 and 2, those are research questions. Okay? Sila yung mga research questions na galing sa chapter 1. Sa chapter 5 sila sinasagot. Okay? Now, itong paragraph after each number, that's the conclusion. Of course, the conclusion should be based on what did you find out in chapter 4. Kung ano yung findings niyo sa chapter 4, dapat doon rin kayo mag-base on how you will construct the conclusions. Okay? So as you can see, wala nang RRL dyan, wala nang citations dyan kasi nga, it's conclusion. You as a researcher, in your own words, ano yung mako-conclude mo regarding sa research questions na pinormulate mo base sa data na nakuha mo sa chapter 4. Okay, so that's how you present conclusions. So, ganito rin. Okay, what are social media etiquettes? So, after that, yung paragraph is the conclusion. Meron lang short introductory sa chapter 5, parang just like what you did in chapter 2, in chapter 3, right? So that's how you do it. Recommendations, on the other hand, these are statements of directions or suggestions that are still in accordance to the results of your study. So, kung base sa kinalabasan ng results ng research mo, ano yung marirecommend mo para mas ma-improve pa ng ibang researcher in the future kung gagawa man sila ng the same research ng katulad ng sa'yo, ano yung marirecommend mo sa kanila? That is what we call recommendations. So this is an example. Although paragraph form siya, what I prefer is ganito. Ayan, naka-number. Okay? Now, recommendations can be for the following. Number 1, recommendations can be a recommendation for the future researchers. For example, yung number 5. The future researchers should pay more attention to expanding their options in choosing their respondents. So, yung gumawa ng sample na to, nagre-recommend sila sa future researchers. That could be one. Number 2, you can recommend for the respondents. Okay, for example, number 1, teachers should be more aware and hands-on to students who experience cyberbullying so that they could help the students refrain from doing unnecessary acts. So yung number 1, nire-recommend ng mga researchers sa teachers kasi sila yung respondents ng research nila. So, pwede kang mag-recommend kung ano yung mga action or suggestions or solutions na pwede gawin ng respondents. So, pwede kang mag-recommend sa respondents, not only sa future researchers, but also sa respondents. Now, number 2, 3, and 4, if you can see the similarity, nag-recommend sila on how to improve the research itself. Okay? Number 2, this research should include more related literature. Number 3, this research should increase the number of the respondents. Number 4, this research should expand its coverage. So, you can also form a recommendation as a way to improve the research itself. So meron kang tatlong ways to construct recommendations. Number 1, you recommend for the future researchers, if ever those future researchers will conduct the same topic as yours. Number 2, you can recommend to the respondents. Ano yung masasuggest mong solutions sa respondents para maiwasan or para ma-improve yung experiences nila dun sa topic mo. Number 3, you can recommend as a way to improve the research itself. Kung kulang yung respondents sa research mo, i-recommend mo ba na damihan yung respondents? Kung kulang yung RRL mo, i-recommend mo ba na damihan yung RRL mo? So, you can do that as a way to recommend, okay, as a form of recommendation. So, that's the last part of our research, chapter 5, which is writing conclusion and writing recommendation. But again, since we do not have much time, we do not have the luxury of time, um, what I did is I already provided a sample data from an interview. So gagawin nyo na lang siya ng chapter 4 and then gagawin nyo na lang siya ng chapter 5. So you don't need anymore to conduct your own interview. You don't need anymore to conduct your own analysis procedure. You don't need to conduct um, your own conclusion. Kumbaga, yung data na gagamitin nyo, binigay ko na. Just to, just to give you ample time and just to give each other, um, what do you call this, enough time to finish what we want to finish kahit na hindi tayo magpapanggap ng kanya-kanya nating research. Okay, so at least you get to be familiar with chapter 4 and 5 with the sample data that I provided. Okay, so if there are still other questions, you can message me privately if there are clarifications. Okay, but please also go back. Okay, please study the previous lectures and this one if you have questions, but at least you are guided all the time. Okay, so I think that will be all for this lecture.